Testing. Can you hear me? Maybe you can. Let's have a new video. Here's some questions. Go ahead and write them down. Today's topic is going to be the plant kingdom. There's a lot to the plant kingdom, some of which you already know. You know, plants are almost always autotrophs. They make their own food. They make their own food. They are multi-celled, usually something you can see. Unicellular plants, stuff you can't really see. They are eukaryotes, which means they have a nucleus in their cells. Pardon me. And plants reproduce by sexual reproduction. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through here. You know, all these plants, they have to be able to get water. And the water and other nutrients have to be able to be transported from one section of plant to the other. So let's talk about that. You know, the water, of course, is going to come from the soil, and it is held in the plant by a part of a waterproof layer called the cuticle. Now, not to be confused with the cuticle we have on our fingernails, the cuticle is like an outer layer, and you can see this outer layer here on kind of a cross section of a plant, and hey, there it is down at the bottom as well. Pardon me. But anyway, that's what a cuticle is, and it kind of helps the water stay in the plant and not just be quickly lost by the cells once it has gotten in it. Now, in small plants, like these little bitty plants down at the bottom here, in small plants, water just travels from cell to cell. Larger plants, though, they have to have transport tissue called vascular tissue, and this vascular tissue transports things in tube-like structures. These tissues are tube-like structures. I mean, if you're this tree here and you're getting water in the roots way down here under the ground, it's got to be able to get all the way up the tree and into even the highest point of it. So here's a couple of vascular tissues. We have the phloem tissue, which is where food moves after it's made in the leaves. So we're talking food. I'll just put F here for food. And we also have xylem tissue, which is where the water and other minerals go up. So these are the two types of vascular tissue we're talking about. Food goes up and down in the phloem. Well, usually down, because the food is made in the leaves and goes down. And xylem is the water usually goes up into the plant. So you kind of have an up and down reaction right there. There are two major plant groups, and we've already talked a little bit about how you're going to categorize them. We have the non-vascular and we have the vascular. The vascular, of course, has this vascular tissue which goes up and down with the food and the water. And you can imagine that these non-vascular plants are not going to be very tall. They're going to be the ones that are just really far down and are just kind of don't really have that need for this tissue going up and down. But anyway, most of these non-vascular plants are going to live in damp, shady places. You have to have that water access. Most of them have thin cell walls. You know, by having sun exposure, it kind of makes the cell wall a little more rigid. So these non-vascular plants that are very far down in shady places are not going to have as much sun exposure. And most of these non-vascular plants are just going to be a few centimeters tall. So most of your plants are going to be vascular plants. These vascular plants can get much taller, they are much more rigid, and they can support drier conditions better than non-vascular plants. Now, scientists think that even the earliest of plants, even the plants in early Earth, did have vascular tissue. That there wasn't a evolution of plants like there was an evolution of humans, some people think. So even at the earliest time, you had you had trees and you had things that were larger, which is kind of interesting there, I think. Well, anyway, a plant's food-making parts must have sun exposure. Talked about how the sun exposure makes cell walls more rigid, helps support these larger plants. And I mentioned about all plants undergoing sexual reproduction. The fertilized egg is called a zygote. Now down here we're going to have kind of the cycle, and zygote of course is part of it. This is the fertilized egg here. Plants often produce spores. Now you may remember that a fungus produces spores too. Some of these spores have sperm cells. Some of these spores have egg cells. So from fertilized egg all the way through to whenever these spores are produced, this whole time from egg to when it's big enough to produce the spores is going to be called the sporophyte stage. Sporophyte stage is going to be up here. And from the production of the spores all the way through to the actual fertilization of the egg is going to be the gametophyte stage. So I guess you have the reproductive stage being the gametophyte stage and the maturing to a mature plant as the sporophyte stage. So you have these spores which have the germination, which has the egg and which has the sperm, which are going to produce, I guess, kind of like the human form of DNA, which combine them to make the zygote. And we're actually going to look at that on one of the next slides. The zygote, of course, is going to grow into more of a plant, which will then produce more spores. Remember, the spores have both a sperm and egg in them, and since the spores will often fly away, in many plants you have the reproduction, which is maybe even nowhere near the original plant. So let's see what we have coming up next. What about plants without seeds? We have mosses, liverwort, and hornwort, which are some non-vascular plants. Remember, they're little bitty plants that do not have seeds. Now, what's going to happen in all of these, there's a portion of the plant which has the spirophytes. You may remember that's kind of the adult part, and a portion of the plant which has the gametophytes. And in a plant that does have seeds, these would kind of fly away. But in these plants, they have to kind of, all the combining of the egg and of the sperm is going to happen here. So it kind of just stays there. It doesn't kind of spread out. It's going to end up being small non-vascular plants. Now, seedless vascular plants include these right here. These happen to be ferns, which is kind of common, club mosses, and horsetails. Now, they do not have seeds, but they reproduce using spores. So this process is going to be similar to those that do have seeds. The newly formed plant is in the gametophyte stage, and later when it's a mature plant, it's going to be in the sporophyte stage, and these spores can indeed fly away, kind of like seeds or pollen does. Here's pollen. You kind of know a little bit about pollen, which takes us back to the seeded plants, which is where you get the pollen. Seeded plants outnumber seedless plants more than 10 to 1. So you're not going to find many like these. You're going to find mostly seeded plants, not the seedless plants. Seeded plants are very important to us. We eat some of them, like rice and peas. We wear clothes out of cotton and flax, and we live in houses that are made by oak and pine or maple. Plus, we breathe in all that oxygen produced by these plants. So, they're a major part of the world's symbiosis, you might say. Now, seeded plants produce pollen, and you're familiar with pollen. This pollen becomes the sperm. And of course, wind and bees or other animals, you see this bee here has pollen all over it, goes from one plant to the next, and it ends up taking some of the pollen to other plants. So what happens to this pollen? Well, here we are at another plant. We have this strange looking pollen grain. But anyway, these plants have a pollen tube in which the pollen grain fits into. So it will end up going down the tube into one of these ovules. And an ovule is where you have the egg. So, of course, bringing the sperm, which is the pollen, together with the egg is what's going to form the zygote. The zygote, of course, is going to be the fertilized egg. Now, once the fertilized egg happens, then it becomes a seed. Now, a seed has the young plant inside of a protective covering. And here's a bunch of seeds right there. So you see the protective covering. Well, you're familiar with seeds. And of course, that kind of protects the plant. But it not only protects it, it also keeps the plant from drying out. And of course, when the seed sprouts, you have a brand new plant again, and it starts into the sporophyte stage all over again. Hey, hope you learned a little bit about plants. Don't forget to do the questions.